Hey everyone, it's Saturn, and before I get into this video, I want to start by saying a massive thank you to everyone who supported my latest two videos. They've both done incredibly well, and I'm really happy about it. Thank you all so much. In my last video, we took a look at the trailer for Pokémon Legends Z-A, and I came up with what I think may be going on. Well, now I've been focusing all my efforts on the map that we see at the end of the trailer. I have done this before with Galar, Hisui, and Paldea, but this is the first time I've actually made a video out of it. Now, I just want to preface this by saying that the map is not actually the map artwork that we often get with each region, usually from the second trailer, but it's actually a shot from the end of the trailer which actually shows us all of Lumio City, which seems to be what we'll be exploring. Bear in mind that in August, or whenever we get the map art, it could be different, and who knows, maybe I'll make a second video then. I firstly want to make sure that I'm very clear in this at the very beginning of this video. I am using deductions and logic based on assumptions that I have made about this game. For example, this whole process has really strengthened my belief in the idea that this game is set in the future, and I will explain why in a very short while. So let's not waste any more time and get into the map of Pokémon Legends Z-A. The first thing to bear in mind is that X and Y were games on the 3DS, and so the map is naturally much smaller, just based on the fact that it's a less powerful console. But they also had to have the entire Kalos region, and as far as we're aware, we only have Lumio City at Legends Z-A. Bearing this all in mind, I think we need to prepare ourselves for a giant Lumio City. Hopefully a comparable size to at least Paldea. From a brief glance at the map, you can tell that there is a lot more detail in the city compared to X and Y, which have very few passages between buildings and exploration within the city. We can see a few ladders in the opening shots of the Z-A trailer, confirming that we'll be able to climb to the top of buildings and traverse the rooftops of Lumios, 15th Doctor style. We did get to do a little bit of this in Mesagoza, but I think it'll feel much different when you'll be able to see the beautiful skyline view in Lumios. Perhaps we'll even get to glimpse at the wider Kalos region, even if we can't explore it in-game. I hope this isn't as touchy as it was in Mesagoza, because I constantly find myself falling off roofs in Scarlet and Violet when I'm just trying to grab items. We also need to bear in mind that we still know very little about this game, and what it will include. For example, are we going to have ride Pokemon like in Legends Arceus? Personally, I don't think we will have them in the same way, as I think there's a bit of a difference between clawing up a cliff than up someone's house. And I'm not sure how residents of Lumios would like it if they saw our Sneasler equivalent destroying their homes. We also know based on the ladder I mentioned earlier that we'll definitely be able to climb up to roofs with ladders rather than Pokemon. I could see the return of Go-Goat Shuffle, which could act like Weirdeer and Tauros, but if this game is a sequel to X and Y like I suspect, there's every possibility that they just give us a bike like we've had in every game before Sun and Moon, as well as Sword and Shield. We could definitely see Go-Goat be the in-universe fast travel Pokemon, similar to the flying taxis in Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, replacing the Lumios taxi service from X and Y, somewhat like the Go-Goat Shuffle that you already had in that game. I also want to take a look at Prism Tower for a moment. One thing I noticed on a second watch of the trailer is that despite the view we see having lots of tiny details, Prism Tower's gym logo is missing. This pretty much confirms that it will no longer be home to the Lumio City gyms, and if gyms are even a thing in this game, we likely won't be meeting Clement or his successor there. It doesn't surprise me much, as Prism Tower is a very important landmark within Lumio City, and so in a game where the main focus is on Lumios and it's not actually focusing on the gyms, you'd likely not want the game's main landmark to be a gym, so it can be used for more important purposes. For example, I could see the climax of the game happening on a high floor of Prism Tower, with you confronting the game's antagonist at the top, similar to the Pokémon X, Y, and Z anime. There is one other incredibly important detail about Prism Tower that I just can't really get my head around. It turns out that the game has rotated it 45 degrees-ish, there or thereabouts. It's not perfect, but 45 degrees works. Not quite sure why, but the tower is just straight up off. It's just completely changed angle. Now this could just be an unimportant detail or design oversight, similarly to how the plazas don't line up with where they were in X and Y, but I just can't help but think that there's something of an importance to it. But just what it is, I couldn't tell you. Hopefully we won't have to wait long to find out more, and more than likely it's just a random detail that they didn't expect anyone to notice or care about that much, and I'm probably just reading into it too much. But hey, that's what this channel's for. Let's take a closer look at the map from X and Y very quickly. The main basis of the map is that you have the central plaza, Centrico Plaza, which is where Prism Tower is, doubling up as the Lumiose City Gym. Keep a note of that, we'll be coming back to it later. The central plaza is surrounded on 5 sides by the 5 key plazas of X and Y, all named after the French words for certain colours. They make up a pentagon shape, which is used to represent the Pokémon that originate from Generation 6 in Pokémon Bank and Pokémon Home. Similar to the Gym Challenge icon from Pokémon Sword and Shield, the Arceus ring for Pokémon from Legends Arceus, and the Terrastar symbol for Pokémon from Scarlet and Violet. Given how important each of the other icons have been to their game's story, it would imply that the plazas are important, right? Well, they barely appear in the X and Y story. The only time you actually even have to see one in-game is when going to Lysander Cafe, as it's in an alley between Magenta Plaza and Autumnal Avenue. We talked in my last ZA video about the fact that this is likely built off of a basis of Pokémon Z, a game which was cancelled but originally due for release in late 2015. I think it's very possible that the plazas were originally intended to have a larger part to play in X and Y, whether that was going to be in Z or not. I don't know, but the obelisks that protrude from each of them imply that they have some importance. Well, I could be grasping at straws, connecting string that ultimately doesn't exist, but I'll tell you one thing that we know for sure. The plazas in ZA have much more importance. Let's talk about it, shall we? The plazas are all named out of the French words for different colours, specifically Magenta Plaza, Rouge Plaza, Jaune Plaza, Vert Plaza, and Bleu Plaza, respectively. And for the purposes of this video, we'll label them as shown here, as I'm pretty confident in how I've lined up the two maps. The plazas don't line up exactly, but this is what happens when you redesign a map from a 3DS game, which was one part of the game, to a map on the Switch, which is, as far as we can tell, the full game map. We know from the trailer that they'll all be very different, not only to how they were in X and Y, but also to each other. I initially speculated in my last video that they would be biodomes, similar to the Indigo Disc's terrarium, as that just seemed to be the most likely thing after that game's recent release. However, on a closer look at the game's trailer, we actually get a look at 2 of the plazas, neither of which are biodomes. The first one, Bleu Plaza, seems to be a hub for trainers, with a fountain in it. It looks quite busy in the trailer, and we see that a battle is going on there. But the one that's far more interesting is one that we only get a look at if you pause the video at the right time. Vert Plaza appears to be a lake with islands dotted around. In some ways, this is similar to my biodomes theory, as it'll be a hub for where we can catch Pokémon. But it's also not quite the same, as it appears to be out in the open. It's quite large as well, as we can see it appears to be 1.5 times as big as Vert Plaza was in X and Y. Unlike in X and Y, the plazas are all different sizes from each other, but are all still perfectly circular. We didn't get to see the other plazas in the trailer, besides a very quick look at Jaune Plaza, which I still can't work out what's going on there. But from looking at the map, we can take some educated guesses as to what they'll be. The one most similar to X and Y's plazas is Jaune Plaza, which is still the same size and is also the same Pokeball shape as it was in X and Y. If I had to guess, this one will likely be like it was in X and Y, possibly even still having the obelisk in the centre of it, though that was left out on the map, which makes me doubt that it's still there. I think that Rouge Plaza is a bit closer to what my original thoughts on the plazas were. We can see that it looks mostly empty, with a structure to the bottom left of it. I think that this will likely be our way of getting a wider variety of Pokemon in the game, as it will be able to simulate different biomes, which will allow us to find Pokemon that don't normally live in urban environments. Take Snover for example. There's a high chance it'll be in the game because Abomasnow has a Mega Evolution. But unfortunately, Snover doesn't really strike me as the type of Pokemon that's going to be wandering the streets of Lumiose. But if the Rouge Plaza does act like a simulation of different environments, then if you simulate a snowy route, potentially calling it the Snowbell Zone after the Kalos region's snow-covered city, you would find the plaza has a number of Ice-type Pokemon, such as Bergmite, Sneasel, and of course, Snover. Now I'm not fully convinced by this, and I'll talk about the Pokemon diversity in another section in a minute, but as of right now, this seems not necessarily likely, but at the very least possible. The one I'm really struggling to work out is Magenta Plaza. I can't quite work out what's going on there, whether it's another spot for trainers like Blur Plaza or whether there's something more going on. Unfortunately, it's very hard to tell what's going on there as you only get a tiny glimpse of it in the trailer. However, if I had to guess, based on what we do see in the trailer, it's not going to be that important. The lines that we see appear to be either painted on or very small kind of walls, but, you know, I don't really know how that's going to play into the gameplay, and until we get a proper gameplay trailer where we get to see it, how it looks actually in-game, I have no idea what to expect from there. That kind of sums up my thoughts on the plazas so far. Clearly most, if not all of them, will have some level of importance that they didn't have in X and Y, but for 3 of them, their main purposes remain unhelpfully vague. Until we get a new trailer, likely in June or August, we'll just have to make some assumptions. Anyway, I think it's time I talked about the biodiversity of Lumio City, as that is currently my main concern for this game as a whole. There are now more than 1,000 Pokémon. Quite a lot, huh? Now, of course, I think it's safe to say we will not be seeing all of them in Legends Z2A, as we haven't seen a game with all of them on Switch. Hopefully, the controversy around that has died down a bit now. I know it's not ideal, but we just kind of have to live with it and move on. And hey, if I remember correctly, which I often do, one of the calls from that campaign was to bring Megas back. And oh look, here they are! So just be satisfied for a bit, please. In all seriousness, so far we know about 60 Pokémon that will be in the game, with either them or a member of their evolutionary family appearing in the trailer. For example, Sylveon and Eevee are both seen in the trailer, so logically Umbreon will also be available in the game. On average, each region's Pokédex has approximately 400 Pokémon in it, so we likely know just over an eighth of the Pokémon available in Z2A. Well, I say that, but Legends Arceus actually had just shy of 250 Pokémon, so there's a chance we know close to a quarter of the Pokémon in Legends EA already. But the diversity in Pokémon is one of my biggest problems with that game, so hopefully they can scrub in a few more and get us closer to about 300 to give us a decently sized Pokédex, especially if the mechanic of researching each Pokémon quite in-depthly doesn't return, which I'm not yet convinced that it will. To be truthful though, I'm less worried about the amount of Pokémon and more about the diversity of Pokémon. In a city, you can't really get many different environments in which Pokémon live. We talked before about Snova, but there's also an example in the trailer itself. We see a group of Sandile and a Crocodile, but where do they live? They usually live in deserts or savannas, like in Scarlet and Violet, Sword and Shield, Sun and Moon, Black and White. Heck, even X and Y has them in a craggy area. Specifically, it's the route near Glittering Cave. Same goes with Hippopotas, which is also in the Z2A trailer. But where will we be able to catch them? Well, personally, I'm still of the belief that we'll be able to go to the Lumos Badlands in order to access the Kalos power plant. But in the event that that isn't true, they have to be found somewhere, right? Same goes for Pokemon like Larvitar, Onix, and even Heracross and Pinsir. I can't imagine them just roaming the streets of Lumios the same way I can with Pokemon like Pikachu, Eevee, Furfrou, Skidoo, and Klefki. Now, I've already suggested that Rouge Plaza could be used to simulate different environments to encourage a wider variety of Pokemon to be available, but let's assume for a moment that that just doesn't happen. Well, I've got 3 other potential ideas, all of which I could see being possible. Let's start with the one that I think is the least likely, but which I'm ultimately the most hopeful for. With the constant teasing from the Pokémon Company and Game Freak, many of us thought that for sure this year would be home to Unova remakes. But of course that didn't end up happening, with us now looking to Kalos, which was staring us in the face this whole time. Well, this theory of mine would not only help to solve the biodiversity problem, but it would also make Unova fans very happy. What if Legends Z2A features the return of not 1, but 2 beloved features that were taken from us before their time? The second being Seasons. Now, of course, they'd have to rework it a bit, as you can't make people wait 3 months to be able to complete the full Pokédex. But having an in-game calendar, similar to how Legends Arceus we got an in-game clock, which is then carried over to Scarlet and Violet, so we didn't have to wait and play at unsociable hours to complete the decks, that would be an easy fix. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom use a similar system in order to calculate when the Blood Moon happens, as well as the many different phases of the moon, so clearly it isn't impossible. Now I really think seasons could be used very well, as it would give us the chance to see Lumiose in different parts of the year, seeing the setting change somewhat and possibly allowing us to do different activities. For example, ice skating on the frozen lake, Ver Plaza, during the winter, or enjoying a Castilia cone at a cafe in the summer. I could see Pokemon like Skidoo, Bellsprout, Flabébé being more common in spring, Vanillite, Mantike and Helioptile showing up more in summer, Pineco, Pumpkaboo and Phantump in autumn, and of course Sonova, Bergmite and possibly even Amora being more commonplace in the winter. It'd be a nice way to see different Pokemon show up, and I think the more I think about it, the more I like the idea. But unfortunately, it's not without its problems. While this works for Pokemon found in snowy routes or by beaches, it's not perfect, as Pokemon found in deserts or marshes don't really have an ideal time of year associated with them. More than loose spaces at least. So as much as I want this to be what they go with, I'm not getting my hopes up. Another option that they could go with is to utilise something that makes Lumiose City wholly unique so far in the Pokemon series, and that it is positioned perfectly in the centre of the region and borders a lot of different terrains. Its borders touch the forest and gardens from Santalune City, the marshy routes of Routes 14 and 16, the Lumiose Badlands, and while its borders don't necessarily touch any icy or coastal areas, I could see them taking some creative liberties with that, and in order to get, what they need. Now this is where my next two theories diverge. Let's start with the one that fits with what Nintendo of America tweeted out during the game's reveal. The different biomes are somewhat seeping into Lumiose City. Now I'm not sure how likely this is, but I could see Lumiose being affected by different ecosystems, as it will of course be much larger than it was in X and Y, giving it enough space to allow for that to work. For example, the part of the city that would normally lead off towards Laver City, you may find a bit of a marshland, where Pokemon like Wooper, Goomy and Krogunk would be found. Near the Santalune City gate, you might find a small garden with Pokemon like Flabébé, Roselia. It's definitely not a perfect solution, and I can't quite picture in my head how it would look, but as a concept, I think it has some promise. But I would need to see it in a trailer to really get whether it was my cup of tea or not. The final idea I had for this section was that you could potentially go outside Lumiose to a very minor degree. Not so far that it would be like the open sections of Pokemon Legends Arceus, but just enough that you'd be able to see a few Pokemon around and catch them. Now this one seems like it's the most likely, simply because it allows us to see a bit more of Kalos as well as giving us an easy way to find these Pokemon in their natural habitats. Going out to the Lumiose Badlands to catch wild Diglett, Sandile and Hippopotas would make far more sense than just seeing them in the street. However, there is one thing we haven't considered for the whole point of this urban redevelopment plan, and that is that the whole point was to make Lumiose City a place where people and Pokemon can coexist in perfect harmony. Would this be shown if we had to go and find certain Pokemon outside the city walls? Personally, I don't think so. I think that somehow, somewhere in this game, there will be some place where these Pokemon are able to comfortably live similarly to their usual home environments. I'm not quite sure what this looks like just yet, but hopefully come June or August we'll know a little bit more about the way that we can encounter a wide variety of Pokemon. Alright, now I want to talk about the oddly high detail that some of the buildings show in the trailer have, and what I think they might mean. I've talked a lot about how this map differs from X and Y and the broader parts of the map itself, but now I want to look at it in more of a vacuum, thinking about the details that we can see in this map alone, rather than comparing it to X and Y, for the most part. When I've been analysing the map, I follow the rule that the more detailed a structure is, the more important it is. Usually because it stands out on the map, but now with a trailer like this, that tells me that Game Freak wanted to draw our attention to these areas. So I'm doing exactly that. The first one I wanted to call out is the smallest one, but it still has some importance in my mind. We don't see it properly until the full map is shown, which strengthens the idea that Game Freak wants us to notice it, because we don't even see it in the trailer, but it's still highly detailed. This location is in the top left of the map, but it's very close to where Trevor's house was in X and Y. For those of you who don't remember, and I don't blame you because X and Y's rivals were forgettable as you like, Trevor was one of our rivals in X and Y. Specifically, he was very into completing the Pokédex for Professor Sycamore. And recently in Pokemon Masters, he appeared in the recent event with Jacques and Volo, where he tells Volo he intends to complete the National Pokédex. Now if this game is a sequel, it's very possible that Trevor is now an assistant to Professor Sycamore, or depending on when it's set, he could even have taken over as Professor. With this in mind, while I have found 2 potential places the Pokemon Lab could be, with one actually being pretty much where it was in X and Y, it is possible that with how important the Pokemon Lab is, they decided to make it a bit bigger, using the land where Trevor's house was to give it enough space. Another option, which is entirely unrelated to it being Trevor's house in X and Y, is that if my theory about us being a member of the Looker Bureau is correct, the Looker Bureau could have moved to this location. Looking at the map compared to X and Y, the Looker Bureau's original location has nothing too detailed, so it's definitely possible that it's moved, as I can't see any sign of where it should be. Well, I would be very surprised if it didn't appear in this game whatsoever, if this game is a sequel. With how Emma's story's left off in X and Y, it seems far more likely to me that she wouldn't just let it go. However, it is a very big building for Looker Bureau, so unless there's been an influx of members, the space feels a little unnecessary. I mean, if the lab is where it was in X and Y, there or thereabouts, then the Looker Bureau is a good multiple times the size. You know, a good at least 3 times. So I could actually see it being something else entirely. Like, for example, a shopping centre. I could see it being a bit like the Hau'oli City shopping centre in the Alola games, but of course this one would be in Lumiose instead. It would probably house a boutique, Pokeball Emporium, and possibly a few other key shops that were dotted around the city in X and Y. That's not to say that there won't be shops dotted around, but I think a few may be housed in this building. Again though, I'm really not sure. The layout of the building and the size would make sense, but it feels an odd place to put a shopping centre. But I guess we'll have to see about that one when we get some more footage. The other one we don't get a good look at in the trailer, but I think is probably quite important, is this oddly dark patch of rooftops. Now, not many other places in this map are quite that dark, with the main one being something we're going to talk about in a minute. This place in particular is interesting to me, however, as the fact it's so big is something I want to call attention to. It is the single longest structure within Lumiose City. According to the map, at least. I checked it against Prism Tower and it's longer, although Prism Tower probably still has more surface area because it's equally long as it is wide. It's even bigger than Rouge Plaza, which is the largest area on this map besides Centrico Plaza itself. And now this building as well. I'm not quite sure what it could be, so why is it so dark? Now, my first thought is that it's an entrance to an underground portion of the game. That would explain why it was so dark, and also it fits in with a lot of what people have been saying. It would make a lot of sense for there to be some sort of underground part of this world, possibly inspired by the Paris catacombs. And while I don't think that we'll see something catacomb-like in particular, I do think that there are high chances of some sort of undercity. And this would make a great entrance to that area. My main questions, if it is that though, is why is it so big and what do the lines mean? Unfortunately, there's very little we can make out from the trailer itself, as the camera is helpfully positioned directly in front of the building, but facing the other way, likely a deliberate choice from Game Freak. However, we can work out that it appears to be quite a tall building, as the lines are more well defined than those of the surrounding roofs. I guess we'll have to wait and see, but I think this building is going to have some importance for sure. There are 2 other very highly detailed buildings in the trailer, and unlike the previous 2, we actually get an okay look at these 2 buildings. At least before the map is revealed. We don't get a perfect look at the first one, as it's slightly obscured from the viewer, but from what we can tell, it seems to be this building just behind the battle court. My initial thought was that this was the Pokemon Lab, as it kind of reminds me of how it looked in the X and Y anime, though I could be misremembering. It's been quite a long time since I've watched the X and Y anime, and I do intend to rewatch it, but anyway, I'm getting off track. But after finding the other 2 buildings that fit better with placement of the lab, it became somewhat less likely. I'm not ruling it out by any means, but I'm just not fully convinced. Looking at its roof, it seems much more highly detailed than the buildings around it, both in the map shots as well as before. It seems that the building is going to be of some importance. Interestingly, it's actually very nearby to where Lysander Cafe was in X and Y. It doesn't line up exactly, as the placement is actually where the juice shop was in X and Y, but it seems that it being close to Lysander Cafe could have some relevance. If I'm right that the logo we see in the trailer is some cover-up for Team Flare similar to Lysander Labs, then I think it's very possible that they have their headquarters here, as it would make sense to have it nearby where Lysander's previous operation was held. The building is very big, even bigger than what I was saying could be a shopping centre, so I'm really not sure, but I think I'm going to stick with the idea that it's either the lab or a new Team Flare cover-up. The final building that I want to talk about is on that same street, and the trailer made sure we got a really good look at this building. Not only is it the tallest building in the trailer besides Prism Tower, but it also seems to have some sort of outer shell protecting its lower levels, or that could just be a larger part of the building, with the top levels being thinner, because they're more exclusive and don't need all the space. It's, the way that this trailer is made, with the aesthetic that they've gone for, makes it very hard to tell those sorts of things. It's almost like the reverse of Rose Tower from Sword and Shield. Now, I have two main thoughts on what this building could be. Firstly, similarly to the last building, this could be where the company that we see the logo for is based. It makes sense as the building already has a full design, which is pretty much the exact same on the architectural drawings, and it does look like it will have a lot of importance within the game. And if it is a Team Flare cover-up, then I think it would make sense as a really great classic Pokémon climb to the top of the tower to defeat the evil team type of climax, similar to Red, Green and Blue and Yellow, Gold, Silver and Crystal, Diamond and Pearl, where the tower is Mount Coronet, Black and White, and of course Sword and Shield. However, what I think is there is a tiny, tiny chance of happening, but that I hope for with my entire being, is that this is where the Pokémon League has moved to within Lumio City. Okay, now hear me out. If this game is a sequel to X and Y, like I theorize, it would be a bit odd if gyms weren't even mentioned. Now, I don't know if they'll be in the game, but if I'm right that the trainer battles will be a focus in this game, it would make sense for them to feature as an optional quest. I think having them be incredibly tough challenges where, with competitive teams based around concepts rather than just types, or if you're going to do types, be a little bit more creative with it, would be a really fun idea. Gyms could either be dotted around Lumios and would scale to your current level based on gym badges or even your party's average level, or you could have them in the building that we're talking about, but you unlock different floors as you progress through the game, with the final battle being against Diantha or her successor at the top of the building. This would be a great way to have X and Y characters return. With some of the gym leaders likely retired, we could even see some new characters. For example, if this game does take place 5 years into the future, I think it's safe to say Ramos will probably be a little tired to still be a gym leader, so we could either see a new grass-type gym leader or possibly even a different type. I could see Dexio and Cena stepping in for Olympia and Wolfric, as they specialise in Psychic and Ice types respectively. And I think it'd be a really fun challenge. We could even see it tie into the plot, as while Malva's status as a member of Team Flare goes pretty much unmentioned in X and Y, sometimes it's hard to remember she was even part of the evil team, and for a while I questioned if it was just in the anime until Pokémon Masters confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that she was in the team, but I could see it playing a level of importance in ZA. As if Team Flare are back, she would likely be confronted by the player, and possibly even Diantha. I could see us facing Malva during the main story and then having her replacement be the Elite Four member we face. Now obviously, this is assuming a lot, and I already pointed out that Prism Tower is no longer a gym in this game. But I think it would be a lot of fun, and just be an additional activity that strengthens the trainer battle aspect of the game, which was sorely missed in Legends Arceus. And also having it be a side quest rather than the main story quest would allow them to make it a tougher challenge that we could really enjoy facing, rather than just being very easy. Not saying anything, but Scarlet and Violet only made me shocked by the gym battles once, and that was Gym 3. But more of that in my Pokemon Scarlet and Violet review, which is still on the way, I promise. Who knows, maybe Game Freak will actually let people other than the Champion and Lysander use Mega Evolution this time. And this would be a great time to bring back held items. I think it's pretty much confirmed that held items are back, based on the fact that Mega Evolution is in this game. But then I think about Let's Go and how you just had to have the item in your bag in order to be able to Mega Evolve your Pokemon. So I hope that held items are back, but I'm not, putting all my eggs in that basket, if you will. Now, these next two buildings aren't especially high detailed, but they stood out to me for another reason entirely. They're actually the gates from X and Y that would have led to routes 4 and 5 respectively. So I very briefly want to theorise on what this means and if it will have a significance to the game's world or story. We're still working with the idea that the game will be set entirely within Lumio City, so having gates would be a bit odd. Especially considering that not only is it not the gates that would actually make sense, but all of the other ones are just straight up gone. They're just not there. There's no even, nothing remotely like them. Just tiny buildings like the rest of the outside of Lumio City. It could be that these buildings have been repurposed in some way that we don't know about yet, but I find it very odd that they line up perfectly with the first gates you see in Lumiose City in X and Y. Specifically the one where you enter Lumiose for the first time with Dexio and Cena coming from Santalune City in Route 4, as well as the gate that takes you out to Camphrier Town. Now bear in mind that gate, after you leave that gate, you don't then return to Lumiose City until you take on the gym after you've already done all the stuff in the Kalos power plant. This is the portion of the game where you discover a lot of the lore that is relevant to the game's, wider world. It's where the Tower of Mastery is found in Shallow City, and it could hold many important details about Mega Evolution that we don't know about, but that we need to know about for this game. And it's also where Geosenge Town is found, of course that being where the ultimate weapon is housed. Also interesting to note, the colours of the Pokemon parts of the Pokemon Legends Z2A logo share their colours with one of Kalos' mythical Pokemon, Diancie, which would seem likely to have connections to both Glittering Cave and Reflection Cave, especially since they both also have ties to Area 0 and Galamine No. 1, which doesn't factor into this theory much, but keep that in the back of your mind for my other theory video that's in the works. With both Glittering Cave and Reflection Cave being part of that section of the game, it seems pretty likely that we may be able to explore that part of Kalos to some extent. Now, obviously, this does not line up with what Nintendo of America said, but they could be keeping this a bit hidden, as it's likely going to be a twist at the climax of the game. But it should be mentioned that it was only Nintendo of America that worded it that way. Even on the Nintendo Switch News app, which I'm pretty sure the English ones for that are published either by Nintendo of America or Nintendo Europe, I can't remember, it simply says, an adventure that takes place within Lumiose City, leaving out the word exclusively, which is interesting. It could hint that there's something else here, that I'm onto something maybe, and before any of my friends comment that I'm biased towards wanting a Diancie return, I am here to openly admit that, as not only is it one of my favourite Pokemon, but it's also the one Pokemon I need to complete my Leving Dex in Pokemon Home. But that doesn't necessarily invalidate all the other points I've shared, like the fact that Diancie is the only mythical and the only Kalos Pokemon to currently have a Mega Evolution, so it would make sense for it to show up. As well as all of the Sinnoh Mythicals being available on Legends Arceus, so it would stand to reason that the Kalos Mythicals would show up in Z2A, right? Hey, maybe they'll even get a cool battle theme like the Galarian Birds or Ruinous Quartet. Okay, I'm getting sidetracked, but in all seriousness, it does feel odd to me that these are the specific gates that are accessible still. It would make far more sense if one of them was the one to Lumiose Badlands, as not only would that tie up the whole section of Kalos, making a nice little loop like we had in X and Y, but it would also just make more sense, as the Kalos power plant feels like a nice place for us to have an important event in the game. It feels a bit odd that we wouldn't see it in Z2A because of how big of an effect it had on Lumiose during the first half of X and Y. It would seem a shame to not let us experience Team Flare, or whoever the villains of this game are, tinkering with the power plants and causing lots of problems that we would have to solve. Okay, maybe I'm just living a bit of a fantasy here, imagining all of the possibilities with this game, but how can I not? I've always had a very active imagination, especially when it came to my favourite franchises, like Pokémon, Doctor Who, and The Legend of Zelda. Ultimately, I know I'm setting myself up for disappointment, but as a game designer myself, I wouldn't want to suppress these thoughts, as even if Game Freak doesn't use them, maybe one day I could tweak them and use them for a game of my own. I think I've probably exhausted talking about the Camphrier Town gate as much as I possibly can. But what about the Santalune City gate? It seems an odd inclusion, but it does have some significance. Not only is it the gate closest to the original Pokemon League building, but it's also where Callum and Serena live in X and Y. I think it would be odd that it's focused on that rather than Anistar City or the Lumiose Badlands, but I do think it's possible that there may be some research we need to do near Santalune City or Vanderbilt Town. I could see it being a post-game area where after you defeat the main story, you can go to Vanderbilt Town and challenge Callum or Serena. It would be cool if they used your team from X and Y, but it's unlikely, as I'm not sure if the Switch and 3DS can connect like that. Before we move on, while none of the other gates are on the map, it is interesting to note that where the gates to Dendermill Town should be, there is now a gap in the wall, which is seen in the architectural drawings as well. It feels odd to have an intentional breach in what seems like an otherwise impenetrable wall, besides the two gates obviously, right? Well, considering that this is the exit that's closest to Anistar City, I'm not sure if it might have some significance. Now, this bit could just be a complete oversight by the devs, or it could have some other importance, but it did strike me as odd, given that like the gates to Santalune City and Cambrier Town, it lines up perfectly with where the Dendermill Town gate was in X and Y. Now, assuming that this is a way we can get to Anastar City, what will the significance be? Personally, I think it would be significant that Anastar City is where you got the upgraded Mega Ring, which is in X and Y, and it's also where the Anastar Sundial is. Clearly, the Anastar Sundial has some relation to Infinity Energy and Mega Evolution, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's not somehow influencing the games, in some way at least. We don't know how much of diseased DNA was put into the X, Y, and Z anime, but it does feel significant to me that Zygarde's ultimate target in the anime is the Anastar Sundial. I think this is all done very intentionally. Even if we don't get to go to Anastar City itself, having a gap in the wall there would allow us at the very least to see the Sundial, almost hinting that it has some sort of importance. I guess we'll have to wait and see though. I'm not quite yet sure what will go on yet, as it feels a bit odd that the other two exits have gates, but Dendermill Town and Anastar City have just a gap in the wall. I guess we'll see. Okay, let's leave the discussion of highly important buildings there for now. I now want to talk about the layout of Lumio City itself. Lumio City is very possibly the most annoying city in Pokémon to try and navigate. That's primarily because the game has no helpful Lumio City map, and the camera angle forcing the camera behind the player no matter where they're facing makes coming out of buildings an unnecessary challenge. Hopefully, both of these will undoubtedly be fixed in Legends Z to A. As Legends Arceus map was pretty great, so I doubt the one for ZA will be much worse, as we're now on the Nintendo Switch, and likely by the time it's released the Switch 2, we should be able to control the camera using the right stick. But of course there is one thing that this game being set entirely within Lumios means: a much more dense layout. Now obviously this was always going to be the case, but it really showed me how different it would be when I overlaid the X and Y map with the Z to A one. Now of course, the basic layout is pretty similar, with Centrico Plaza in the centre, surrounded by 10 streets, 5 of which having plazas. The main difference between X and Y and Z to A is that between those main streets you have lots of different alleys and roads to explore, with different buildings and pathways. You had a few in X and Y, but most of them were just connecting up the different avenues. Now they are like a world unto themselves, with them all being incredibly dense, filled with buildings and likely people. And hopefully, you'd also hope, Pokémon. Now here's the thing, I doubt it's going to be hard to get lost, but hopefully the map will help rectify that. We can see that the game is most likely going to start us off in one part of Lumios to get us used to the game a bit, like how Breath of the Wild you started out in the Great Plateau, or in Tears of the Kingdom you have the Great Sky Island, or a bit like how to get used to the catching Pokemon mechanic you had Prelude Beach in Legends Arceus. That'll be where our tutorials on how to catch Pokemon and our first couple of battles will be. Now I think it is possible, however I'm not sure how likely it is, that this will happen outside of Lumio City. I think it's at least a possibility to take into account that you could start in Santalune City. It feels an odd choice for a game that is set pretty much entirely within Lumios according to Nintendo of America, but Santalune City could be a good way to start off, as it would let you catch your first few Pokemon and have a trainer battle or two on the way to Lumio City. Perhaps Professor Sycamore or Dexio and Cena show up to give you a partner Pokemon, as you're going to need one in the big city. Of course, you need a reason to go to Lumios, and of course I'm still of the opinion that you'll be a part of the Looker Bureau, so maybe you need a Pokemon for your job, or you're being trained before starting your position full time. Of course, the far more likely option is that you actually start in Lumios, but a very small part of it. Like the area near Ver Plaza, as that's where the Pokemon Lab is most likely located. But it could be anywhere, to be honest. Having a small section to explore before you're let off the chains and able to explore the whole city would be a smart way to have the player get used to the core mechanics of the game and get to know a part of the city, so the rest is not so daunting. I think it would make sense to have the map unlock in different parts like it did in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, rather than being able to see everything like you could in Scarlet and Violet. I think it's very possible that they do this with the plazas. Maybe there's an NPC in each one who upgrades your map to have that part of Lumios unlocked. Bombarding the player with too much information too early on could cause confusion, and ultimately may make them less interested in exploring. Ultimately, it depends on how big the world is. While Lumios looks more dense, looking at the size of certain buildings, I do worry a little bit about how big this world will be. The radius of the city is 6 prism towers, including the one in the centre. That doesn't really worry me too much, but I'm hoping that there is a bit more to it, considering how small Paldea felt. I'm not really sure whether Legend Zeta A's Lumiose City will be enough to really scratch that open world itch which I've had ever since first playing Breath of the Wild and exploring Hyrule for the first time. Now that really is a world which I can get lost in forever. Even with Tears of the Kingdom, I've got more than 250 hours, with most of that just being rediscovering the Kingdom of Hyrule, which I already knew from Breath of the Wild. Having a Pokémon game that has a world just as exciting to explore would be great. I think the one thing they could do to give that feeling in Legend Zeta A would be adding something like Hero's Path Mode from the Zelda titles, as it's one of my favourite parts of the exploring process. I get to see everywhere I've been, and just how much I've explored. It also tells me that where I should look that I haven't looked before, as I could find a Korok or something else that needs to be that I need to complete the game to 100%. Just a reminder, we could very possibly see a Zygarde self-fetch quest like in Sun and Moon in this game. It'd be really fun if we had a way to see where we've found them before, and where we need to look that we haven't potentially looked before. Interestingly, the trailer confirms that there will be a different elevation within the city, which is something we didn't see in X and Y. When Pikachu is running past the cafe, you can see some steps which trainers are walking down. I'm not quite sure where to place this on the map, because nothing is obviously showing from the different elevation, but it is very cool that we'll get to see more varied Lumiose City. It's one of those things that we definitely won't get a definitive answer to until we have the game in our hands, so I'm going to be contemplating it for a while. But now, there are a few final parts of this map I want to call attention to, so let's take a look at them. I'm just going to jump right into this one rather than wasting your time with a long introduction. Firstly, I can see a few battle courts, similar to the ones in Scarlet and Violet, dotted around the map. Now, like in that game, clearly not all of our battles will be held on those courts, but hopefully a few more will, as some of the courts in Scarlet and Violet felt pretty much useless, like Zappico, which you can't even use in single-player gameplay as far as I can tell, as well as the ones to either side of Mesagoza when you only use the central one, because that's where you fight Nemona at the end of the game. I could see us having a few rival battles at these locations, or possibly being where we fight important trainers like NPCs, gym leaders. One of the parts of the map that I want to call attention to is the bottom left park-like area. Now I can't really work out what this is, as, like with the large building in front of it, the camera is facing the wrong direction. My current working theory is that it's a roller skate park. The Carlos games use roller skates as a way to get people used to 360-degree movement, as it was a new feature for those games. And if you cast your minds back, on Route 5, just after leaving Lumiose City for the first time, you come across a roller skate park. I think it would make sense for there to be one in Lumiose City as well now. I highly doubt that we'll be using skates like we did in X and Y, so I could see them adding in a roller skate park as a callback to the past, as a way you can kind of get that feeling in HD. There is the possibility that if I'm right about the gyms being dotted around Lumiose City, this is where you'd find Karina. And even if I'm not, I could see you meeting her here, as it's very likely that she'll have taken over her grandfather's position as the Mega Evolution Guru now, especially as she seems to fill that role in Pokémon Masters. I also want to very briefly talk about the building on the edge of the city near there, as it appears to be very tall based on how bright it is. By the way, just so we're all on the same page here, how bright a building is kind of tells you how tall it is, because it tells you how many floors there are, because each floor is kind of defined on its own. It would also make a good location to find another gym or another important building, so I'll be interested to see if it features in any trailers. Interestingly, I can't find anything that resembles a Pokémon Center whatsoever on the map. The closest I can find is this building with a Pokeball shape on its roof, but it does feel slightly strange that there's no obvious signs of one or more. And actually, from a bit of a closer look, this seems to just be a bigger battle court, more like a stadium, which just really confuses me because I can't find now anywhere where Pokemon Centers could be. I know that they used to blend in Lumiose City a little bit more than the other ones in Carlos, but it does still feel a little bit strange that we can't see a single one after how distinctive they were in Scarlet and Violet. It could be that there is only one Pokemon Center in Lumiose, making the game a bit more survival focused like Legend of Arceus, where you had to manage your resources to keep your Pokemon healthy when away from base camps. But it does feel a bit strange after there were two in X and Y. You'd think there'd be at least two in this entire game world. Okay, so there's one last area that I annoyingly cannot work out what it is just yet. You can see a ladder or staircase going up towards a higher area, which appears to connect the river with a small offshoot. If I had to guess, I would argue this is our coastal area in the game, which is great, glad it's there, and that does help the biodiversity discussion I brought up before. But if it's not paired with at least seasons, or with us being able to explore outside like I talked about in the previous section, I don't know how effective it's going to be. Coastal Pokemon definitely were ones I was thinking about in regards to how they'd show up, like, you know, Wiglett, Sandygast. It would be nice to see them here, but it does feel a bit odd when this appears to be the only ecosystem area. I could see them putting traditionally desert-based Pokemon here, but what about ice types, marshy Pokemon, Pokemon that live in forests, etc.? You know, it's just a slightly odd inclusion, but hopefully we'll get some more clarity on it pretty soon. Okay, I think that about covers it. I've got a lot to talk about when it comes to this game, as I'm very excited. And I feel the possibilities are pretty much endless. But as promised, I'll finish off my Scarlet and Violet review, as well as my Legends Arceus review. Then I think I've got a bit more of an in-depth theory about Zeta A and its ties to a few other recent games. But for now, let me know what you've spotted down in the comments, and tell me your theories while you're there. I'll talk to you all again soon, I'm sure. But for now, goodbye.